The cruelest thing about power is how quickly people assume you don't belong. At exactly 8:54 on a cold Manhattan morning, Naomi Carter sat alone in the marble lobby of Carter Global Holdings while three white executives walked past her like she was invisible. Rainwater dripped softly from the hem of her charcoal gray coat onto the polished black floor beneath her chair, each drop echoing faintly through the giant glass atrium of the building her own mother once cleaned at night 30 years earlier. The receptionist behind the desk barely looked up when Naomi first walked in. "Visitor sign-in is to your left," the young woman had said flatly, sliding a clipboard across the counter without making eye contact. Naomi signed nothing. She simply thanked her politely and sat down beneath the silver company logo mounted high on the wall, the same logo she had once sketched on a napkin inside a cramped Chicago apartment while balancing overdue utility bills on her kitchen table. Outside, traffic crawled slowly through Lexington Avenue under a gray February sky. Yellow cabs sprayed dirty rainwater across the curb, while businessmen rushed inside with leather briefcases tucked beneath expensive wool coats. Nobody noticed the black woman sitting quietly near the elevators. Nobody except Richard Coleman. The senior executive stepped out of the revolving doors at 8:56 sharp, laughing alongside two other board members while adjusting the cufflinks on his pale blue shirt. Richard carried himself like the building belonged to him. At 6'2" with silver hair and a perfectly tailored navy overcoat, he looked exactly like the kind of man magazines trusted with billion-dollar companies. His eyes landed on Naomi for barely 2 seconds before his expression tightened with irritation. He slowed his pace just enough to glance toward the receptionist. "Lobby seating isn't for maintenance staff," he said casually, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Please keep the executive area clear before the board arrives." One of the younger associates beside him smirked under his breath. Another gave Naomi the kind of uncomfortable half-smile people use when they don't want to challenge cruelty, but still want credit for noticing it. Naomi looked up slowly, calm and unreadable, her dark eyes reflecting the white ceiling lights above her. "I'm waiting for a meeting," she said softly. Richard gave a dry laugh. "With who?" He checked his watch dramatically. "The cleaning crew?" Quiet chuckles rippled through the lobby. Naomi heard every single one. She also noticed the security guard near the elevators suddenly avoiding eye contact. The receptionist lowered her gaze toward her computer screen, pretending to type. Across the room, a young Hispanic intern carrying coffee trays froze awkwardly beside the hallway entrance. Nobody stepped in. Nobody ever did in moments like this. Richard adjusted his coat again and leaned slightly closer toward Naomi before speaking in a lower voice. "People get uncomfortable when someone wanders into places they don't belong," he said. "You should probably use the service entrance next time." Then he walked away without waiting for an answer, expensive shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor as the other executives followed him toward the private elevators reserved for upper management. Naomi remained perfectly still after they disappeared. Only her fingers moved slightly against the leather strap of her bag resting on her lap. Above her, the giant digital screen hanging over the lobby rotated to the company's slogan in glowing white letters, "People First." Naomi stared at the words for several silent seconds while rain streaked slowly down the massive glass windows behind her. The irony almost made her smile. Almost. At 8:58, another employee hurried past carrying a stack of presentation folders. He accidentally dropped one near Naomi's chair, papers sliding across the floor. Naomi bent down immediately to help gather them before he could kneel. "Thank you," the young man muttered distractedly, then paused when he finally looked at her face. Something about her calm expression seemed to unsettle him. "Are you here for the shareholder meeting?" he asked carefully. Naomi handed him the folders one at a time. "Something like that," she replied. The young employee nodded uncertainly before rushing toward the elevators. Naomi leaned back into her chair afterward and glanced toward the large bronze clock mounted above the lobby entrance. 8:59 a.m. One more minute. Around her, Carter Global moved with the cold efficiency of a machine too important to slow down for ordinary people. Assistants hurried across the marble floors in high heels. Executives barked into Bluetooth headsets while elevator doors opened and closed with soft metallic chimes. Somewhere deeper inside the building, laughter echoed from the executive corridor Richard Coleman had disappeared into moments earlier. Naomi listened quietly to all of it while the city lights shimmered faintly through the rain behind her. Then the clock finally turned to 9 o'clock. The elevator doors near the executive corridor opened exactly at 9 o'clock, and the energy inside the lobby shifted so suddenly that even the sound of footsteps seemed to disappear into the polished walls. Four men in dark suits stepped out first, followed by an older woman carrying a leather portfolio against her chest. Every employee nearby straightened immediately. Conversation stopped in mid-sentence. The receptionist stood so quickly her chair rolled backward into the desk behind her. Naomi remained seated beneath the silver company logo while rain continued sliding down the towering windows overlooking Lexington Avenue. One of the board members, a gray-haired man named Walter Bishop, scanned the lobby once before his face changed completely. "Miss Carter," he said with visible relief. "We have been trying to reach you upstairs for 20 minutes. The silence that followed felt heavier than the marble beneath everyone's feet. Richard Coleman froze halfway toward the executive elevators. Emily Foster slowly lowered the tablet she had been carrying. Daniel Reeves stared directly at Naomi as if his mind could not process what he was seeing. The receptionist blinked twice before whispering under her breath, "Oh my God." Naomi rose calmly from her chair and smoothed the sleeve of her coat. She did not look angry. That was the part that unsettled Richard the most. There was no dramatic expression on her face. No satisfaction. No need to prove anything. She simply looked tired. Walter stepped closer immediately. "The board meeting is ready whenever you are," he said carefully. Naomi gave a small nod. "Thank you, Walter." The older man glanced briefly toward Richard and the others standing near the elevators. His expression hardened almost instantly. Richard attempted a quick smile, though the color had drained from his face. "Naomi," he said awkwardly, trying to recover his confidence. "I did not realize you were coming in personally today." Naomi finally looked at him directly. Her gaze remained calm enough to make him visibly uncomfortable. "That was the point," she replied softly. Nobody spoke after that. The lobby suddenly felt colder than before, the air carrying the faint metallic scent of rain drifting in each time the revolving doors turned. Naomi picked up her black leather bag from the chair and walked toward the elevators with Walter beside her. Employees instinctively moved out of her path. Some lowered their eyes. Others stared openly in disbelief. The young Hispanic intern from earlier stood frozen near the hallway entrance, still holding an empty coffee tray. Naomi paused briefly beside him. "What is your name?" she asked gently. "Luis," he answered quickly. "Luis Mendoza." Naomi nodded once. "Thank you for being kind earlier, Luis." The young man swallowed hard and managed a quiet, "Yes, ma'am." Richard watched the exchange with growing panic spreading behind his eyes. He suddenly understood something far worse than embarrassment. Naomi Carter had not walked into the building by accident. She had come unseen on purpose. Inside the elevator, the mirrored walls reflected the tension hanging between everyone. Walter pressed the button for the 48th floor while nobody moved or spoke. Richard loosened his tie slightly, though the temperature inside the elevator remained perfectly comfortable. Emily stared down at her tablet without reading a single word on the screen. Daniel shifted his weight from one foot to the other every few seconds like a man trapped inside a room, growing smaller by the minute. Naomi stood near the back corner, quietly listening to the soft hum of the elevator cables. Pulling them upward through the tower, she built from nothing. She remembered sleeping in her mother's car during Chicago winters while her mother worked double shifts cleaning office buildings downtown. She remembered eating dollar store crackers for dinner while studying financial textbooks borrowed from public libraries. Most of all, she remembered promising herself one thing when Carter Global became successful enough to matter. She would never allow the company to become the kind of place that made ordinary people feel invisible. Yet less than 6 minutes inside her own headquarters had shown her exactly what the culture had become while she was gone. The elevator display slowly climbed higher. 32, 39, 44. Nobody noticed Naomi quietly watching the reflections in the mirrored walls instead of the people themselves. Reflections were honest. They showed fear long before words ever did. The conference room on the 48th floor overlooked nearly all of Midtown Manhattan, but Naomi barely glanced at the skyline as she entered. 20-foot windows stretched from floor to ceiling, framing the gray morning clouds rolling slowly above the city, while soft jazz drifted quietly through hidden speakers in the ceiling. A long walnut table sat at the center of the room beneath warm recessed lighting, surrounded by executives who suddenly looked far less confident than they had downstairs only minutes earlier. Some stood as Naomi entered. Others avoided eye contact completely. The scent of fresh coffee and polished wood hung in the air, but underneath it lingered something sharper now. Fear. Walter pulled out the chair at the head of the table for her, without saying a word. Naomi thanked him quietly and sat down while assistants hurried nervously around the room, adjusting presentation screens and placing documents near each seat. Richard Coleman remained standing near the far side of the table with one hand resting against the back of his chair. He was trying very hard to appear composed, but Naomi noticed the slight tremor in his fingers immediately. She noticed everything. Across from him, Emily Foster whispered something to Daniel Reeves, whose jaw stayed clenched so tightly the muscles near his temple twitched each time he swallowed. Nobody knew exactly why Naomi had returned without warning. That uncertainty frightened them more than anger ever could. Carter Global had become one of the largest logistics and infrastructure firms in the country under Naomi's leadership. But over the last 18 months, she had stepped away from daily operations after expanding several international divisions overseas. During that time, Richard and the executive committee had quietly reshaped the culture inside headquarters into something colder, more exclusive, more concerned with image than humanity. Naomi could feel it the moment she walked through the doors downstairs. Walter opened the meeting carefully. Before we begin quarterly projections, I believe Ms. Carter would like to address the board directly. Several executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Naomi folded her hands together on the table and looked around the room slowly. The silence stretched long enough for people to become uneasy beneath it. Outside the windows, rain tapped softly against the glass high above the streets below. This morning, Naomi finally said, I spent 6 minutes in our lobby. Nobody moved. In 6 minutes, I watched an intern get ignored while carrying enough work for 3 employees. I watched a receptionist assume a black woman entering this building could not possibly belong here. I watched senior leadership mock someone they believed had no power. Richard inhaled sharply, but said nothing. Naomi's voice never rose. That made every word land harder. And the most disappointing part, she continued, is that nobody seemed surprised by any of it. Emily straightened in her chair. Naomi, I think perhaps there has been some misunderstanding regarding the situation downstairs. Naomi turned her eyes toward her calmly. Was there a misunderstanding when your hiring department rejected 43 qualified applicants from historically black colleges last quarter? Emily froze completely. Daniel quickly looked toward Richard, silently searching for direction. Naomi opened the folder in front of her and slid several printed reports across the table. Or was there a misunderstanding when internal surveys showed minority employees felt discouraged from applying for executive roles? The room became painfully quiet except for the faint hum of the ventilation system overhead. One older board member removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in his chair with visible concern spreading across his face. Naomi looked down briefly at the company logo embossed into the leather folder before her fingertips. She remembered the first office she ever rented for Carter Global, 400 square feet above a pawn shop on the south side of Chicago. Her mother had cried the first time she saw Naomi's name on the glass door because nobody in their family had ever owned anything before. Naomi built the company believing success meant opening doors for people who had spent their entire lives locked outside of them. Somewhere along the way, the people sitting around this table had forgotten that. Richard finally cleared his throat. If there are concerns about company culture, we can certainly review internal policies moving forward. Naomi looked at him for several long seconds. Richard, she said quietly, culture is not what people say during meetings. Culture is what people allow when they think nobody important is watching. The words settled heavily across the room while rain continued falling against the windows behind her, washing the city in cold silver light. The cruelest thing about power is how quickly people assume you don't belong. At exactly 8:54 on a cold Manhattan morning, Naomi Carter sat alone in the marble lobby of Carter Global Holdings while 3 white executives walked past her like she was invisible. Rainwater dripped softly from the hem of her charcoal gray coat onto the polished black floor beneath her chair. each drop echoing faintly through the giant glass atrium of the building her own mother once cleaned at night 30 years earlier. The receptionist behind the desk barely looked up when Naomi first walked in. "Visitor sign-in is to your left," the young woman had said flatly, sliding a clipboard across the counter without making eye contact. Naomi signed. Nothing. She simply thanked her politely and sat down beneath the silver company logo mounted high on the wall, the same logo she had once sketched on a napkin inside a cramped Chicago apartment while balancing overdue utility bills on her kitchen table. Outside, traffic crawled slowly through Lexington Avenue under a gray February sky. Yellow cabs sprayed dirty rainwater across the curb, while businessmen rushed inside with leather briefcases tucked beneath expensive wool coats. Nobody noticed the black woman sitting quietly near the elevators. Nobody except Richard Coleman. The senior executive stepped out of the revolving doors at 8:56 sharp, laughing alongside two other board members while adjusting the cufflinks on his pale blue shirt. Richard carried himself like the building belonged to him. At 6'2" with silver hair and a perfectly tailored navy overcoat, he looked exactly like the kind of man magazines trusted with billion-dollar companies. His eyes landed on Naomi for barely 2 seconds before his expression tightened with irritation. He slowed his pace just enough to glance toward the receptionist. "Lobby seating isn't for maintenance staff," he said casually, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Please keep the executive area clear before the board arrives." One of the younger associates beside him smirked under his breath. Another gave Naomi the kind of uncomfortable half-smile people use when they don't want to challenge cruelty, but still want credit for noticing it. Naomi looked up slowly, calm and unreadable, her dark eyes reflecting the white ceiling lights above her. "I'm waiting for a meeting," she said softly. Richard gave a dry laugh. "With who?" He checked his watch dramatically. "The cleaning crew?" Quiet chuckles rippled through the lobby. Naomi heard every single one. She also noticed the security guard near the elevators suddenly avoiding eye contact. The receptionist lowered her gaze toward her computer screen, pretending to type. Across the room, a young Hispanic intern carrying coffee trays froze awkwardly beside the hallway entrance. Nobody stepped in. Nobody ever did in moments like this. Richard adjusted his coat again and leaned slightly closer toward Naomi before speaking in a lower voice. "People get uncomfortable when someone wanders into places they don't belong," he said. "You should probably use the service entrance next time." Then he walked away without waiting for an answer, expensive shoes tapping sharply against the marble floor as the other executives followed him toward the private elevators reserved for upper management. Naomi remained perfectly still after they disappeared. Only her fingers moved slightly against the leather strap of her bag resting on her lap. Above her, the giant digital screen hanging over the lobby rotated to the company's slogan in glowing white letters, "People First." Naomi stared at the words for several silent seconds while rain streaked slowly down the massive glass windows behind her. The irony almost made her smile. Almost. At 8:58, another employee hurried past carrying a stack of presentation folders. He accidentally dropped one near Naomi's chair, papers sliding across the floor. Naomi bent down immediately to help gather them before he could kneel. "Thank you," the young man muttered distractedly, then paused when he finally looked at her face. Something about her calm expression seemed to unsettle him. "Are you here for the shareholder meeting?" he asked carefully. Naomi handed him the folders one at a time. "Something like that," she replied. The young employee nodded uncertainly before rushing toward the elevators. Naomi leaned back into her chair afterward and glanced toward the large bronze clock mounted above the lobby entrance. 8:59 a.m. One more minute. Around her, Carter Global moved with the cold efficiency of a machine too important to slow down for ordinary people. Assistants hurried across the marble floors in high heels. Executives barked into Bluetooth headsets while elevator doors opened and closed with soft metallic chimes. Somewhere deeper inside the building, laughter echoed from the executive corridor Richard Coleman had disappeared into moments earlier. Naomi listened quietly to all of it while the city lights shimmered faintly through the rain behind her. Then the clock finally turned to 9 o'clock. The black flash. Drive sat in the center of the conference table like something heavier than plastic and metal. Nobody reached for it. Nobody even breathed too loudly near it. Outside the windows, Manhattan disappeared deeper into gray rain, while distant sirens echoed faintly through the streets nearly 50 stories below. Naomi folded her hands calmly in front of her and watched the faces around the table one by one. Richard Coleman tried to maintain his executive posture, but the confidence that once filled the room around him had started cracking apart in small, visible ways. His jaw tightened too often. His fingers tapped once against the table before he quickly stopped them. Across from him, Emily Foster looked pale beneath the soft overhead lights. Daniel Reeves stared directly at the flash drive without blinking, as if refusing to look at Naomi herself might somehow make the situation less real. Walter finally cleared his throat quietly. "The footage has already been reviewed by legal counsel," he said carefully. Richard turned toward him sharply. "You reviewed surveillance footage without notifying executive leadership?" Walter did not flinch. "Executive leadership is precisely why it was reviewed." The words settled heavily across the room. Naomi leaned slightly forward in her chair. "Do you know what surprised me most?" she asked softly. Nobody answered. It was not the comments. It was not the assumptions. It was how comfortable everyone looked while doing it. Her eyes moved toward the rain-covered windows for a moment before returning to the table. Cruelty becomes culture when nobody believes there will be consequences. Richard exhaled slowly through his nose. "Naomi, with respect, you are turning isolated incidents into a larger narrative." Naomi reached toward the flash drive at last. She slid it gently across the polished walnut table until it stopped directly in front of Richard. "Play the file," she said. Richard hesitated. The room remained silent except for the low hum of the projector mounted overhead. Finally, Daniel reached for the drive with visibly stiff hands and plugged it into the conference system beside him. The large presentation screen at the far end of the room flickered softly before security footage appeared. Timestamp after timestamp rolled across the screen. Employees entering the building. Reception interactions. Elevator checkpoints. Quiet moments most executives never noticed because they never thought those moments mattered. Then the first clip played. A black woman wearing a housekeeping uniform approached the front desk asking for temporary elevator access after her badge malfunctioned. The receptionist sighed dramatically before telling her to wait aside, while 3 white consultants were immediately waved through without verification. The next clip showed a young Asian analyst speaking during a networking event while 2 executives mocked his accent after he walked away. Another showed a Latino employee being mistaken for catering staff while carrying presentation materials to a boardroom meeting. Nobody spoke as the clips continued. Each one only lasted seconds, but together they painted something impossible to deny. A pattern, a culture, a quiet hierarchy of human value operating beneath the polished image of the company Naomi built. Richard's face hardened as the footage played. "This is selective editing," he muttered. Naomi looked directly at him. "No, Richard. It is selective attention. These things happened every day. You simply never cared enough to see them." Emily rubbed her hands together nervously beneath the table. "We can implement new sensitivity training immediately." Naomi's expression remained unreadable. "You think this is about training?" Her voice stayed calm, but disappointment moved through every word like slow-moving thunder. "People do not reveal character during seminars. They reveal character when they believe nobody important is watching." The final video clip appeared on screen. The lobby from earlier that morning. Richard standing near Naomi's chair. His voice filled the room through hidden speakers. "Lobby seating is not for maintenance staff." The audio sounded even colder played back inside the silence of the conference room. Nobody looked at Richard now. Nobody wanted to. Naomi watched the screen without expression while rainwater streamed down the windows. Behind her in silver ribbons. Then came Richard's second comment. "You should probably use the service entrance next time." The recording ended. Silence swallowed the room completely afterward. Even the ventilation system seemed quieter somehow. Daniel slowly lowered his eyes toward the table. Emily stared motionless at her own reflection in the dark conference screen after the video faded to black. Richard sat completely still for several seconds before speaking at last. "I did not know who you were," he said quietly. Naomi looked at him with calm exhaustion instead of anger. "That," she replied softly, "is exactly the problem." For several long seconds after Naomi spoke, nobody in the conference room seemed willing to move at all. The screen at the end of the table remained dark now, reflecting only blurred outlines of frightened faces beneath the soft recessed lighting overhead. Outside the towering windows, rain continued falling across Manhattan in slow silver sheets, washing the city into muted colors while distant traffic crawled through the storm far below. Naomi leaned back quietly in her chair and listened to the silence settle over the room. She had spent years inside boardrooms larger than this one. London, Singapore, Atlanta, Los Angeles. She knew the sound executives made when they were calculating risk instead of truth. The room was full of that sound now, even though nobody was speaking. Richard Coleman finally loosened his tie slightly and looked toward the windows before speaking in a quieter voice than before. "I understand how this appears," he said carefully. Naomi's eyes remained steady on him. "No," she replied softly. "You understand how it sounds now that consequences are involved." Richard looked away immediately. Across the table, Emily Foster stared down at the reports spread before her like someone hoping the numbers might somehow rearrange themselves into innocence if she avoided looking up long enough. Daniel Reeves rubbed both hands together slowly beneath the table, his wedding ring catching the dim gray light coming through the rain-covered windows. Nobody defended themselves anymore. The confidence had disappeared from the room. Entirely. Naomi glanced toward the city skyline outside and allowed herself one quiet breath. She remembered another rainy morning nearly 20 years earlier when her mother had waited outside a downtown office building in Chicago because security refused to believe she worked there. Naomi had been 16 then, sitting inside an old sedan with broken heat vents while watching her mother stand in the freezing rain, holding a janitor uniform folded carefully over one arm. Her mother never complained afterward. She simply smiled tiredly and said, "Some people only recognize value when it wears expensive shoes." Naomi never forgot those words. Even now, sitting at the head of a multi-billion-dollar company, she could still picture raindrops sliding down the windshield of that old car while her mother warmed her hands against paper coffee cups from a gas station. The memory settled quietly inside her chest as thunder rolled faintly outside the building. Walter finally spoke from beside her. "The board has reviewed the footage and internal reports thoroughly." His voice remained calm, but heavy. "The findings are deeply concerning." One of the older board members nodded slowly without lifting his eyes. Another closed his folder altogether and folded both hands in silence. Naomi looked around the room again. "Do you know what hurts most about all of this?" she asked softly. Nobody answered. "It is not the disrespect toward me. I have survived worse than rude executives." Her voice stayed even, almost gentle now. "It is knowing there are employees in this building who experience this treatment every single day without power, without protection, and without anyone walking into the room to defend them afterward." The words lingered heavily in the air. Emily's eyes lowered toward the table again. Daniel swallowed hard. Richard stared motionless at the dark conference screen. Naomi stood slowly from her chair and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. Her heels moved softly across the polished floor while rainwater streamed down the glass inches away from her reflection. Below, thousands of people crossed crowded sidewalks, carrying umbrellas through the storm, each one fighting private battles nobody else could see. Naomi rested one hand lightly against the cold window. "When I started this company," she said quietly without turning around, "I promised myself something. Nobody working here would ever feel small simply because the world already treated them that way outside these walls." The room remained silent behind her. "Somewhere along the line," she continued, "success became more important than humanity." A faint crack of thunder echoed again above the city. Naomi closed her eyes briefly before speaking one final time. "And if a company forgets the humanity of ordinary people," she said softly, "then it no longer deserves their loyalty." Nobody argued with her. Nobody could. The only sound left in the room was the rain sliding down the windows and the quiet hum of a building suddenly forced to confront the truth about itself. The storm outside began to weaken just after noon, leaving long trails of rainwater gliding slowly down the glass walls of the conference room while pale sunlight tried to break through the clouds above Manhattan. Inside the room, however, nobody seemed aware of the weather anymore. The atmosphere around the table had shifted into something heavier than tension. It felt like exposure. Naomi remained standing near the windows with one hand resting lightly against the cold glass while the board members sat in silence behind her. Richard Coleman looked older now than he had only an hour earlier. The sharp confidence that once defined every movement he made had faded into exhaustion. Emily Foster sat perfectly still with her hands folded tightly together in her lap, staring at nothing. Daniel Reeves had not spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Walter finally opened a thin folder near the center of the table and adjusted his glasses carefully. "There is one final matter the board needs to address," he said quietly. Nobody interrupted him. Walter looked toward Naomi first before continuing. 3 weeks ago, several members of executive leadership submitted a proposal requesting expanded operational authority during Ms. Carter's absence overseas. Richard's eyes narrowed immediately. Naomi slowly turned away from the windows. Walter opened the folder completely. The proposal included provisions limiting direct oversight from the founder's office regarding hiring procedures, executive promotions, and internal personnel reviews. One of the older board members sighed heavily beneath his breath. Naomi walked slowly back toward the table, her heels moving softly across the polished floor. "You attempted to remove accountability," she said calmly. Richard straightened in his chair. "We were trying to modernize the company structure." Naomi looked directly at him. "No, you were trying to protect yourselves from scrutiny." Nobody defended him this time. Walter slid several signed documents across the table. "There is more," he said quietly. Naomi glanced down at the pages. Internal emails, private communications, hiring directives, comments executives assumed nobody outside their circle would ever read. One message from Daniel described a black management candidate as not polished enough for executive visibility. Another from Emily instructed recruiters to focus on applicants who reflected the company's preferred professional image. Naomi read each page silently while the room remained motionless around her. Then she reached the final document. Richard's signature sat at the bottom beneath a recommendation limiting diversity initiatives due to what he called brand perception concerns. Naomi lifted her eyes slowly toward him. Richard swallowed once before speaking. Those conversations were taken out of context. Naomi held his gaze for several seconds. Context is what people hide behind after the truth becomes public. The silence afterward felt endless. Outside the windows, sunlight finally touched part of the skyline, turning the wet glass towers across the city pale gold against the fading storm clouds. Naomi looked around the room once more, but this time her expression carried something different beneath the disappointment. Clarity. The board members sensed it immediately. Walter closed the folder quietly. "The board has reached a unanimous decision," he announced. Richard's face lost what little color remained. Emily lowered her eyes instantly. Daniel pressed both palms flat against the table as though trying to steady himself physically. Naomi remained standing, calm, silent, certain. Walter continued carefully. "Effective immediately, Richard Coleman is terminated from his position as Chief Operating Officer. Emily Foster is terminated from her role as Director of Human Resources. Daniel Reeves is removed from executive leadership pending further review." Nobody reacted right away. The words simply settled across the room like the final moments of a collapsing structure. Richard stared blankly at the table in front of him. Emily's eyes filled with tears she tried unsuccessfully to hide. Daniel looked toward Naomi one final time, but whatever argument he once believed he had was already gone. Naomi did not smile. That was what unsettled them most. There was no revenge in her expression, no satisfaction, only sadness. Richard finally spoke in a strained voice barely above a whisper. "After everything I helped build here," Naomi interrupted him gently. "You helped build revenue," she said softly, "but you damaged people." The room fell silent again. Naomi gathered the folders slowly into neat stacks before looking toward Walter. "Who handled front desk staffing this morning?" Walter checked a page quickly. "Temporary receptionist rotation from corporate services." Naomi nodded once. "Keep Luis Mendoza. Promote him into the operations fellowship program." Walter blinked in surprise. "The intern from the lobby?" Naomi picked up her coat from the back of her chair. He was the only person downstairs who looked uncomfortable watching someone else be humiliated. Soft sunlight spread gradually across the windows behind her while the storm finally drifted beyond the city skyline. And for the first time all morning, the room no longer felt controlled by fear. It felt controlled by truth. By early afternoon, the rain had completely stopped, leaving the city washed clean beneath pale winter sunlight that reflected softly across the glass towers of Midtown Manhattan. Inside the executive floor, however, the atmosphere remained quiet and heavy long after the board meeting officially ended. Employees moved through the hallways more slowly than usual, whispering carefully near elevators and avoiding direct eye contact whenever senior staff walked past. News traveled quickly inside buildings like this, especially news powerful people never expected. Naomi stood alone near the conference room windows for several minutes after everyone else had begun leaving. Below her, traffic filled the streets again while steam drifted upward from subway grates into the cold afternoon air. She loosened the sleeve of her coat slightly and closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the silence settle around her after hours of tension. A soft knock interrupted the quiet behind her. Naomi turned slowly. Richard Coleman stood near the conference room doorway holding a thin leather folder against his side. Without the confidence of his title surrounding him anymore, he suddenly looked like an ordinary, aging man carrying the weight of mistakes he could no longer hide behind polished language or expensive suits. "Do you have a moment?" he asked quietly. Naomi studied him for a second before nodding once. Richard stepped inside carefully and closed the door behind him. The room felt different now, smaller somehow, less powerful. Sunlight stretched across the walnut conference table where fear had sat only an hour earlier. Richard looked toward the windows instead of directly at Naomi. "I wanted to apologize," he finally said. The words sounded unfamiliar coming from him, like something rarely spoken aloud. Naomi remained silent. Richard swallowed once before continuing. "Not because of what happened to me today. I understand why the board made its decision." He looked down briefly at the folder in his hands. "I am apologizing because somewhere along the way I stopped seeing people clearly." Naomi watched him carefully without interruption. Richard gave a tired laugh under his breath. "When I first joined this company 12 years ago, I admired what you built. Everyone did. A black woman creating one of the most respected logistics firms in the country from almost nothing." His voice softened slightly. "But after enough success, enough meetings, enough pressure from investors and corporate circles, you begin convincing yourself that image matters more than humanity." Naomi crossed her arms lightly against her coat, and people who did not fit the image became invisible. Richard nodded slowly. "Yes." The honesty in the room felt uncomfortable because it arrived too late to change anything. Outside the windows, sunlight glimmered against rainwater still clinging to neighboring skyscrapers. Naomi looked toward the city below before speaking. "Do you know what the saddest part is?" Richard lifted his eyes toward her. "You are not an evil man, Richard." He looked surprised by the statement. Naomi continued quietly. "That is what makes this dangerous. Most discrimination inside places like this does not come from monsters. It comes from ordinary people who slowly stop questioning their assumptions." Richard lowered his gaze again. For the first time all day, Naomi saw genuine shame on his face instead of fear. He placed the leather folder carefully on the conference table between them. "Those are my resignation documents and transition notes," he said softly. "Everything the next leadership team will need." Naomi glanced at the folder, but did not touch it. Richard looked around the room one final time. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "you were right about one thing." Naomi waited. Richard gave a small, tired nod toward the windows overlooking the city. "A company does reveal its soul by how it treats people nobody important is supposed to notice." The words hung gently in the sunlight between them. Naomi finally walked toward the table and rested one hand lightly against the leather folder. "People can change," she said softly. Richard looked at her carefully, almost uncertain whether he deserved kindness from her anymore. Naomi's expression remained calm, but only after they are willing to see what they became. Richard nodded once, slower this time. Then he quietly turned and walked toward the conference room door without another word. Naomi watched him leave while sunlight continued spreading across the empty chairs around the table, warming the room that had felt so cold only hours earlier. By 6:30 that evening, most of the lights inside Carter Global headquarters had gone dark. The long hallways that usually carried the sharp rhythm of expensive shoes and hurried conversations now rested in near silence beneath soft amber lighting. Outside the glass walls of the tower, Manhattan shimmered beneath the cold evening sky, streets glowing with reflections from headlights and storefront windows still wet from the afternoon rain. Naomi stood alone in her office overlooking the city she had spent half her life fighting to survive. The room was elegant but simple. No oversized portraits. No trophies displayed behind glass. Just bookshelves, warm lighting, and one framed photograph resting near the corner of her desk. Her mother stood in the picture wearing a janitor uniform beside a much younger Naomi outside their old apartment building in Chicago. Naomi picked up the frame carefully with both hands and smiled faintly at the worn edges around the photograph. "We made it, Mama," she whispered softly into the quiet room. Somewhere down the hallway, an elevator chimed gently before the sound faded again. Naomi set the picture back down and walked slowly toward the windows. Below her, thousands of strangers crossed intersections carrying shopping bags, rushing toward trains, laughing beneath scarves and winter coats, living ordinary lives that most executives inside buildings like this rarely noticed. But Naomi noticed them. She always had. That was why the company existed in the first place. A quiet knock sounded at her office door. "Come in," Naomi said gently. The door opened carefully, and Luis Mendoza stepped inside wearing the same Navy intern badge clipped to his jacket from earlier that morning. He looked nervous enough to stop breathing correctly. Naomi smiled softly. "Relax, Luis. You are not in trouble." He let out an embarrassed laugh and stepped farther into the office. "Walter said you wanted to see me." Naomi nodded toward the chair across from her desk. "Sit down for a minute." Luis sat carefully, still glancing around the office like someone afraid he did not belong there. Naomi recognized that look immediately because she had worn it herself once. "How long have you been with the company?" she asked. "About 7 months," he answered. "Operations internship program." Naomi nodded slowly. "And what do you want after the internship ends?" Luis hesitated before answering honestly. "Honestly, I just want a chance. Nobody in my family has ever worked in a place like this before." Naomi looked toward the city lights outside the windows for a moment. "Mine either," she said quietly. Luis looked surprised. Naomi smiled faintly. People see buildings like this and assume the people inside were born belonging here. Her eyes returned to him calmly. "Most of us were not." The young intern sat quietly listening while soft evening light reflected across the glass walls around them. Naomi walked back toward her desk and picked up a slim folder. The Operations Fellowship Program includes executive mentorship, graduate tuition support, and leadership placement after completion. Luis blinked in disbelief as she handed him the folder. "Wait, this is real." Naomi gave a small nod. Walter already approved the transfer. Luis stared down at the folder in his hands, speechless for several seconds. "I do not know what to say." Naomi rested one hand lightly against the edge of her desk. "Then say nothing. Just remember this moment someday, when you have power of your own." Luis looked up slowly. Naomi's voice remained calm and warm beneath the soft office lighting. "Do not become the kind of person who only sees value in people wearing expensive suits." Luis nodded carefully, emotion filling his face too quickly for words. After he left the office a few minutes later, Naomi remained standing near the windows alone once again. The city stretched endlessly beneath her in silver and gold lights, while traffic moved slowly through the streets below like rivers of glass. Somewhere far down on the lobby level, cleaning crews had already begun their night shifts, quietly polishing floors most executives would walk across tomorrow morning without noticing. Naomi looked down toward the streets one final time before turning off the office lights behind her. In the darkness, only the skyline remained glowing beyond the glass, reflecting softly beside the faint outline of her mother's photograph resting on the desk. And for the first time in a very long while, the building no longer felt cold.